In the fall of 1968, the week after we buried my father, the lawyer read out my share, 11 acres of apple trees he had quit pruning 9 years before, grown so thick a man could not walk a row. My brothers took the house, the tractor, and the good bottomland, and they did not hide their smiles. Everyone in that kitchen agreed I had been handed a thicket and a tax bill. It took me 1 year under those trees to understand what my father had actually left me, and what I found in the last row would change how I heard his name. I was 19 that fall. The orchard sat on the north hill above the barn, 11 acres of winesap and Grimes Golden and Rome Beauty that my grandfather had set out in rows, straight enough to sight a rifle down. My brothers were practical men. Del said an unpruned orchard was firewood standing up, and Carl said it plainer than that, and the county assessor, who came out with his clipboard and his good shoes, wrote down a figure I could have carried in my shirt pocket. None of them were unkind about it. They simply saw no reason to be wrong. My father had let it go in the spring of 1959. I was 10. One April he was up on the ladder with the long shears, and the click of them working carried down to the house all morning, and the next April he sat in the kitchen with his coffee and looked out the window at those trees the way a man reads a letter he already knows by heart. Nobody in our family ever said why. When I asked him, he told me the trees knew what they were doing, and that was the whole of his answer for 9 years. So I walked up there alone the Monday after the funeral, briars to my waist, deadwood snapping under my boots, and I found his pruning shears hanging on a nail in the orchard shed. 6 letters, punched from the backside so they stood up proud on the face of the tin, and if you closed your eyes and laid your thumb across them, you could read them the way a blind man reads a hymn board. H-A-R-L-A-N. My father had done it with a nail set and a light hand, and he had left the strip a little long at both ends so the nails would hold when the trunk swelled, which it had, so that by then the tin was pinched into the bark like a ring on a fat finger. That tree stood alone at the east end of the last row, with its head full of water sprouts, 12 feet of new wood shooting straight up out of the old scaffold limbs, and it looked like every other neglected apple tree in that orchard, except that it had my name on it. The reading was in Ferris Kell's office above the bank in New Antioch, 3 windows, a ceiling fan with one blade painted a different white than the others, and 11 of us on borrowed chairs. My father had been dead 9 days. Ferris read it slow, the way he read everything, and it did not take long. The home place went to my Uncle Dale, the house, the barn with the tool outlines painted on the wall, the machine shed, the grain bins, and the 160 acres of bottom ground along Little Sandy that had never once failed to make corn. The pickup and the tractor went with the ground. The savings, what there was, went to the hospital in Coalport and to the funeral home, and Dale had already paid both and had let a few people know it. To me went 11 acres east of the lane, 80-some apple trees, a stone-lined dry well with a plank cap, a pump house with no pump in it, and whatever weeds were standing on it the day the paper got signed. Nobody laughed out loud. My Aunt Verna made a small sound with her mouth closed, and my cousin Bick looked at the floor with his shoulders going. Dale patted my knee twice, the way you'd gentle a colt, and said, "Well, hell, Harlan." That was the whole of it. There was no cruelty in that room that you could have pointed at and named. It was just 11 people agreeing without speaking that the good ground had gone where good ground goes, and that the boy had been handed the part of the farm his father had quit on, because that was the thing everybody knew. My father, Emmett Coyle, had let that orchard go. Not sold it, not cleared it, not hate it. Let it go. 12 years of Februaries had come and gone with that curved saw hanging on its hook in the barn, in its painted outline, with a fur of dust down in the teeth. The tar can sat on the shelf beneath it with the lid on so long the lid had rusted into one piece with the can. Every man in that county knew what an unpruned apple tree turns into. It turns into a thicket. It throws up wood that will never carry fruit. It shades out its own bearing limbs. It gets scab and it gets borers. And what apples it does make come out small and knotty and drop in the grass for the deer and the yellow jackets. 11 acres of that is not a crop. 11 acres of that is a nuisance you pay taxes on. Dale came out to see me about it before the week was over. He stood at the end of the lane with his hat pushed back and looked down the rows the way a man looks at a coat that has moths in it. 200 an acre, he said. That's better than it'll bring. I asked him what he'd do with it. Push it, he said. pile it up on the low corner and burn it in the spring, and have corn in there the year after. You'd be surprised how quick it comes back to ground. He said it kindly. He meant it kindly. Dale was 56 years old and had buried his only brother, and he could not stand to look out his kitchen window at 11 acres of ruin that used to be the prettiest planting in Pell County. He said, "Your daddy'd have done it himself if he'd had the heart." I was 28. My mother had been dead 6 years. I had no wife, no children, no dog at the time, and I was on the night shift at a retread plant in Coalport, hosing black rubber dust off a concrete floor from 11 at night till 7 in the morning, and I had $460 in the First National and a Ford with 200,000 miles on the odometer and a bad universal joint. The taxes on those 11 acres came to $62. I could pay them. That was not the pressure. The pressure was that every reasonable person I knew, including the ones who wished me well, could see plainly that I was about to spend my one inheritance on nothing, and they were prepared to be patient with me about it for exactly one season. Word got around the way it does. At Rain's brother's feed on a Saturday, a man I'd known all my life said, "You're the cider king now," and everybody at the coffee pot enjoyed that. Old Fay Dickerman told me she'd give me $1 a bushel for windfalls to feed her hogs, and she was not being unkind, she was being practical, and that was the market rate for what my father had left me. A fellow from the county extension office came by with a clipboard, walked out about 40 feet, looked up into that mess of sprouts, and said something about how you could not save trees that far gone, that the money was in taking them out. He wrote a number on a card for a man with a dozer, but there was the tin. That is what nobody had an answer for, and I asked. I asked Dale, I asked Verna, I asked Ferris Kell, I asked 2 old men who had picked in that orchard for my grandfather. A particular man, a man who painted outlines for his own hammers, does not punch his son's name into a strip of roofing tin, climb down off the ladder, and then abandon the ground around it. Ferris only said, he was specific, and shut the folder. The last thing my father did that I could account for was hang up the saw. The last thing he did that I could not account for, I found the following Sunday, when I went through his key ring on the kitchen table, key by key, and discovered that the padlock on the pump house door was a Yale, and there was not one Yale key on it. I sat a long while with those keys spread out on the oilcloth like a hand I'd been dealt wrong. There were 11 of them, the house key, worn shiny, the Barnes, which had never once been turned in my lifetime, a flat key for the padlock on the diesel drum, the ignition key to the Ford, wired to a bottle opener from a beer company that had gone out of business before I was born. 2 keys whose teeth were rounded down to nothing, kept the way a man keeps a bolt he might someday find the nut for, and a brass one stamped with a 5-digit number, which turned out to belong to the mailbox at the old highway address, the one they took out when they widened the road in 1961. 11 keys, and every last one of them accounted for, and none of them a Yale. The pump house sat 60 feet off the back corner of the packing shed, 8 foot by 10, cinder block to the waist and board and batten above, with a tin roof gone the color of a nickel. I had been past it 1,000 times without looking at it. When I did look, standing there with my hands in my coat pockets and my breath going up sideways in the wind, I saw a thing I should have seen the first week. The door was newer than the building. The hasp was newer than the door. And where the shackle of that padlock rode against the staple, the brass was still bright, the way brass is bright for a year or 2 before the weather takes it. My father bought that lock late. He hung it late, and then he went and hung up his saw. I hunted the key for 9 days. I went through the coffee can of cotter pins on the workbench and the Bull Durham tin of tacks and the cigar box where he kept his fuses. I went through the bib pocket of the overalls that still hung on the nail behind the cellar stairs and found a pencil stub, a nickel, and a shirt button. I felt under the truck seat until my knuckles came out gray with dust. I ran my fingers around the underside of the cistern lid, thinking of the tape he used to use for hiding things, and got nothing but cold and rust. I even shook out the flour canister, which is the sort of thing you do on the 8th day, when you have quit being reasonable. There was a hacksaw hanging in the barn. There was a bolt cutter, too, and a cold chisel, and a 4-pound hammer, and any of them would have had that lock off in the time it takes to boil coffee. I know because I stood there with the hacksaw in my hand twice that winter. What kept me from it was Ferris, and the way he had shut that folder, and the 2 words he used. A man who wipes down a pruning saw and oils the pivot and hangs it on its two nails before he goes in the house to die is not a man who loses a key by accident. So I went to work on the trees instead, because February was going, and pruning does not wait on a man's curiosity. I want to be honest about how bad it was. 41 apple trees, most of them 30-some years old, and none of them touched in 8 years. The water sprouts stood straight up off every scaffold limb like broom straw, hundreds of them to a tree, thin and pale and useless, and inside all that mess the good wood had gone dark, and crossed, and rubbed itself bare. There were mummies still hanging from the twigs, apples from 2 summers back shrunk to black knuckles, and every one of them a little bag of rot waiting on a warm rain. My hands cracked open across the knuckles by the 4th day. I taped my right thumb with friction tape and kept going. The pole pruner's rope was frayed to a whisker, and I spliced it twice and finally replaced it with clothesline, which stretched and made the blade lazy, and I learned to allow for it. The saw wanted the whetstone at noon and again at dusk. Applewood cuts sweet and smells sweeter, something like cider and something like tea, and I would come in at dark with that smell in my sleeves and sawdust in the cuffs of my pants and sleep like a man who had been hit. The brush pile got to be the size of a hay wagon, then 2 hay wagons. I burned it on a still Sunday and stood in the smoke for an hour, and I did not get through 12 trees that first week. Wednesdays I went to the co-op for kerosene and whatever else, and there were always 3 or 4 men at the coffee counter by the window, and I was news. Kurt Ellender had hauled apples to the cannery in Rossville for 20 years before it closed, and he took it upon himself to keep me informed of my situation. "You aim to prune all 40 of them?" he said, and then, to the room, "Prettiest firewood in the county, and he's out there giving it a haircut." I told him I'd got 12 done, and it had taken me till dark most nights, and that at that rate I'd be finished about the time the county paved my road. That got a laugh I could live with, and Bernd Sattler slid a nickel across for my coffee without saying anything about it, and I went home. On the last day of February, a man came walking up my row. He was 81 years old, and he had a pruning saw wrapped in a feed sack under his arm, and he did not knock at the house. He came straight out to where I was working, Hollis Bar. He had helped my father in that orchard for 30 springs, and I had known him as a shape on a ladder when I was a boy. He looked at the tree I was standing under, and he looked at the pile I had cut off it, and he said, "You're cutting scared." Then he opened up the feed sack and went to work on the next tree over, and for 2 hours the only sounds were 2 saws in the cold and the brush hitting the ground. At noon we sat on the tailgate with a thermos between us. He asked me if I had been up past the windbreak. I said I hadn't, that there was nothing up there but locust brush and grass and a rock pile, and he drank his coffee and looked out at the row and said, "He never quit the orchard, he quit the pruning." I have thought about that sentence more than about almost anything anybody ever said to me. We walked up there after dinner, through the gap in the black locusts where the wind sits all winter. The grass was hip-high and dead and combed over flat by snow. And standing in it, in rows, spaced as even as fence posts, were 23 young apple trees, knee-high to shoulder-high, each one grafted, the union a hard knob about a hand above the ground, still wrapped in electrical tape gone gray, 9 of them caged in hog panel against the deer. And running through the grass from tree to tree, so hidden that I stepped over it twice before I saw it, was a 1/2-inch black poly line with a little brass emitter at every trunk, and that line ran back down the hill, through the locust to us, and out along the low edge of the old orchard, and ended at the pump house door with the Yale padlock hanging on it like a closed mouth. So he had been carrying water uphill. That was the first plain fact I had about my father in 4 years, and I stood there in the hip-high dead grass with the ring of useless keys in my fist, doing arithmetic I had no business doing. 23 trees, 1/2-inch line. 400 feet of hill, give or take, and every foot of it going up. The padlock took me 40 minutes with half a hacksaw blade wrapped in a shop rag, working the shackle from underneath the way you cut a green sapling, back and forth, resting my wrist, going again. The blade skated and screeched and left a bright silver wound in the brass, and when the shackle finally parted it made a small sound, hardly anything, and the 2 halves of it dropped into the grass and I never did find them. Inside was cool and smelled of cold cement and iron. A shallow well jet pump sat bolted to a concrete pad, painted a green that only pumps are painted, with a blue pressure tank beside it, and a gauge on the tank sitting flat at 0. On a shelf made of a barn board and 2 blocks, a coil of black polyline still in its wire ties, a paper sack of brass emitters, a coffee can holding barbed tees and couplers, and short ferrules that rattled like hard candy, a roll of thread tape gone yellow at the edges, and a screwdriver worn down to a nub with his thumbprint sanded into the handle. There was a nail in the stud by the door, and hanging on the nail by a loop of baling twine was a spiral notebook with a pencil tied to it. I want to tell you I read the notebook first. What I did first was flip the light switch, because the bulb was right there over my head in a wire cage, and the switch went click, and nothing happened at all. I found out why standing outside in the wind. On the pole at the fence corner, the meter socket was empty. Just the socket, the glass gone, the guts gone, and a paper tag wired through the hasp, faded gray-pink, from the co-op. They had pulled it in November. My father had gone into the hospital in October, and the account had gone quiet, and the co-op does what the co-op does. It took 12 days to get power back to that pole, $75 deposit, a form with my name on it in my own handwriting under the words "Responsible Party," and a young man in a bucket truck who asked me twice if I was sure I wanted a second service turned on for a shed. I said I was sure. He set the meter and spun it with his finger and said, "It'll be hot in about a minute," and drove off down the lane, and I stood there in the mud, listening to a light bulb hum in a pump house I had cut my way into. Around town, they had already gotten the joke worked out. The woman at the co-op counter called it the old orchard, the way you'd say the old dog, kindly and past tense. A man at the feed store asked me if I was going to sell pies by the road, and another one said no, he's going to sell shade, and they laughed at that. And I laughed too because it was funny, and because there is no percentage in being the only one in a room not laughing. My uncle came out on a Sunday, walked the fence line with his hands in his coat, and told me what a dozer runs by the hour. He was not being cruel. In his mind, he was handing me a way out and being decent about it. The pump caught on the second prime. I filled the case with a 5-gallon bucket, screwed the brass plug back in, threw the switch, and it screamed like a hurt cat for 11 seconds and then took hold, and the needle on that gauge crawled up off 0 to 20, to 30, to 40, and the pressure switch snapped off, and the whole little building went quiet, and I sat down on the cement with my back against the tank and grinned at nothing like a fool. Then I walked up the hill, and the hill was full of fountains. Mice had wintered in that line, so had voles, and something with better teeth than either. Every 10 or 15 feet, a fine, bright thread of water stood up out of the dead grass in the morning sun, pretty as anything, and by the time the line got to the 4th row, there was no pressure left to push anything anywhere. The top 9 trees, the caged ones, the ones he had bothered to protect, got nothing but a wet ring the size of a saucer. I counted 31 holes that first day. Cut, insert coupler, clamp, move on, knees soaked through, thumbs cracked from the barbs. The hardware store in town had 3 couplers. They ordered more, and the more came in 9 days later. By the 2nd week of June, we had gone 26 days without rain, and the pump began losing its water every afternoon around 3, sucking air, chattering, shutting itself off on the overload. That was when Orval Tig walked up the hill without being asked, 79 years old, carrying nothing but his own 2 hands, and stood looking at that green pump for a while. "It's a dug well," he said. "Rock laid, 32 foot. Your daddy never watered in the daytime in his life. He run it an hour before daylight and let the well have the rest of the day to come back. So I got up at 4, and it still was not enough. 14 of those young trees had no cage on them, and the deer found them the way deer find things, and they took the leaders off 4 before I got tomato cages around the rest of them. I bought those cages 10 at a time at the co-op in Ainsley, the flimsy green kind meant for staking up better boys, 79 cents a piece, and I stood them over those little whips and drove a stake through the wire and told myself it looked like husbandry. Deer do not bite a leader off clean. They pull. You come up the hill at first light, and the top 8 inches of a 2-year-old tree is hanging by a strip of bark with the sap still beating up on the break, and the tree does not die from it, exactly. It just forgets what it was doing. It quits going up. It sends out 3 shoots where there ought to be 1, and none of them knows which is in charge, and you spend the next 4 years deciding for it. I was buying my 4th batch of those cages when Delmas Prather said, loud enough for the whole counter, that he had never in his life seen a man work that hard to raise deer feed. It was not mean. That is the thing I want to be honest about. There was real affection in the way this county laughed at me that summer, the way you laugh at a dog that keeps digging in the same hole. Hollis Renfro from the elevator said those trees had quit bearing before I quit shaving, and everybody agreed that was funny, and I agreed too, because it was. Orval Teague was standing at the far end of the counter with a fan belt in his hand, and he did not laugh and he did not scold anybody. He said 11 words. I have thought about them a lot since. That hill made more money than any of ours one time. Then he paid for his fan belt and went out, and the counter got quiet in a way that had nothing to do with me. Saturday morning there were 3 trucks at my gate at 7:10. I had not asked anybody for anything. I want that understood, because I could not have asked. I did not have the money to pay a man for an hour, and asking for free help in that country is a thing you only do twice in your life, once when your barn burns and once when they bury you. Delmus Prather had a flatbed with 40 cedar posts on it, cut green off his own ridge, the bark still sticky, and a post driver he had made himself out of pipe and a chunk of railroad iron. Orval's grandson Lyle, 19 years old and built like a gatepost, had 2 rolls of woven wire and a fence stretcher. Hollis Renfro came in a car, in his good shoes, which he ruined, and never once mentioned it after. And behind them all came the Fenner boy, in the mill truck, with a load of spoiled alfalfa, gray on the outside, still faintly green in the middle, sweet and sour at the same time, in a way that gets in your clothes. Orval came last, walking, carrying nothing but his own 2 hands. We worked until 2 in the afternoon. We cut the woven wire into 5-foot lengths and rolled each one into a cylinder as big around as a bushel basket and set it over a tree and drove 1 post beside it, and by noon my palms had gone through blister and out the other side into something numb and useful. Lyle drove posts the way young men do, 4 blows apiece, standing flat-footed. Delmus set the line. Hollis carried wire and said very little. And Orval walked the rows behind us with a pitchfork he found in my barn and showed me how the mulch went on. Off the trunk, he said. Hand's width of bare dirt all the way around. You bank hay against a young tree, the mice move in for the winter, and girdle it under the snow where you can't see, and come April you got a dead tree and no idea why. So we forked spoiled alfalfa in a wide flat ring around every one of those 14 whips, and then around the ones that already had cages, and then, because there was hay left and the day was still there, around the old trees too. It took 3 of us to do a big one. Those old trunks are 3 feet through at the base, and the ground under them was hard as a road from 30 years of nobody watering, and nobody mulching, and nobody doing anything at all. Orval said Daddy had hauled sawdust from Fenner's mill every March for near on 30 years. Went down with the truck and a scoop shovel, and took 2 loads and put it in the rows, and paid for it in apples, and old man Fenner had been dead 9 years and his grandson still had the standing arrangement written on the back of a feed ticket tacked to the office wall. I drove down there that next week to see. It was still tacked up. It said, in pencil, sawdust for apples, 2 loads every March, standing, no charge on the loader. Under it, in a different pencil and a smaller hand, somebody had kept a tally, little upright marks in bundles of 5, run across the bottom of that feed ticket, and then up the side of it where the room ran out, and I stood in the doorway of that office with my hat in my hand and counted them twice, and got 31 both times. 31 marches. The last 3 marks were lighter than the rest, made with a pencil that wanted sharpening, and after them there was nothing at all. Del Fenner came in off the yard while I was counting. He was maybe 35 then, sawdust in his eyebrows and in the creases of his neck, and he had that mill way of talking loud even indoors because half his hearing had gone into the blade. He knew who I was before I said it. He said I had my daddy's walk, which is a thing people kept telling me that year, and which I have never once been able to see for myself. I asked him what the sawdust was worth now. He didn't hedge. He said there was an outfit out of Springfield hauling every cubic yard he could make, bagging it for horse bedding, $11 a yard delivered, and they'd take it faster than he could pile it. He said he ran the blower into a trailer now instead of a heap. He said the heap had cost him money for years and he'd kept making it anyway, off in the fence corner past the log deck, because the ticket was still up on the wall and his granddad had put it there. Then he took me out and showed me. 3 years of sawdust that nobody had come for. The top of it was pale and dry and the color of a biscuit, and when I put my boot in it, the sides slid away. And down at the base it had gone black and sweet and warm, real compost, steaming a little in the cold the way a manure pile will. He had moved that heap twice with the loader to make room for logs. He had turned it because it wanted turning. He had held 2 loads a year out of a paying contract for a man who had quit coming, and he had not once driven out to our place to ask why. I offered him money. He put both hands in his coat pockets, which is how a man out here tells you no without having to say the word. Orders paid, he said. I told him 3 years of nobody coming for anything was not the same as paid, and he looked out at the heap like it had spoken up in his defense, and then he said the thing that turned me around in my boots. That paper ain't your daddy's. He walked me back in. The office was warm in that dry, scorched way a wood stove makes a small room warm, and the walls were shingled over with tickets and calendars and a 1961 feed store thermometer that had quit at 50. He put his thumb under the corner of the note and lifted it so I could see the paper had gone the color of weak tea everywhere except the little square where the tack had shaded it. My granddad's hand, he said. He took it off your granddad, and he wrote it down so nobody'd have to remember it. I read it 3 times. Sawdust for the mounds, 2 loads, spring and fall, hardwood only, no walnut. And under that, our name, spelled the way people out here have always spelled it, which is wrong, with the extra letter that none of us ever bothered to correct. I asked him about the walnut. Walnut don't get along with anything, he said. Kills a garden dead and takes its time doing it. Granddad kept the walnut in a separate pile his whole life on account of that line right there. He let the paper fall back flat against the wall. I sorted out by the smell mostly. You can smell walnut through a glove. So that was one thing I learned standing in a hot little office in the cold end of February, that a man I had never met had told a man I had never met to keep the walnut out of my grandfather's sawdust, and that both of them were dead, and that the walnut was still being kept out. He loaded me with the tractor, 2 buckets of the black off the bottom of the heap, which came up in slabs and broke apart wet and steaming and smelling like the inside of a cellar, and then a bucket of the pale dry off the top, and he told me to put the dry on last because it would hold the wet down on the drive home. He set the 3rd bucket easy, the way you'd set a cake down. Then he stood back and looked at my father's truck sitting low on its springs, and said the springs were fine, they'd had worse, and I understood that he had loaded that same truck before. I did not offer him money again. I have thought about that since. There are men you can pay and men you can only accept from, and it takes a while to learn to tell them apart, and it takes longer to learn that accepting is its own kind of work. The load steamed the whole 11 miles. I could see it in the mirror, a little gray thread coming off the top of the pile, thin as breath, standing straight up when I slowed for the crossing, and laying back flat over the tailgate when I got up past 40. 11 miles of that. I went by the co-op with my window down because the smell was better moving than sitting, and a man out front loading feed sacks lifted his chin at me the way men do when they have decided not to say the thing they are thinking. Past the school, past the church with the hand-painted sign, then the long grade down to the creek where the road turns to gravel, and the gravel turns to 2 ruts and a crown of Johnson grass, and the whole way I kept looking in the mirror at that little gray thread as if it might be worth something, which of course it was, though nobody in that county would have argued the point with me for free. I got home in the last blue part of the evening. I should have left it in the bed and gone in and eaten and slept, and I have never once in my life done the sensible thing at the end of a haul. I found the fork with the bent tine hanging on the shed wall, and the wheelbarrow with the tire that would not hold air past Thursday, and I unloaded that truck 1 barrow at a time in the dark, with a work light hooked over the mirror, and I counted, because counting is the only way I know to keep from thinking about how much is left. 22 loads. It steamed off the fork every time I set it into the pile. My hands were done at 9, and I went on until 11. I put it where the pruning stopped. That is the thing I want you to hold on to, because it is the thing I could not stop looking at all that first winter. My father had worked those rows for 31 years, and then he had quit. And he had not quit the way a man quits a whole field, walking out of it at the gate and never coming back. He had quit in the middle. You could stand at the north end of the fourth row and read it like a page. The first 11 trees were shaped, opened out in the middle, the way he liked. The old cuts grown over smooth and gray, with that little collar of healed bark around them. That means the tree accepted what was done to it. The 12th tree had one cut, high on the east side, clean, and nothing after that. And then 30-some trees down that row, and every row past it, gone up into a thicket of water sprouts. Every one of them shot straight for the sky, no fruit worth the word, the limbs crossing and rubbing and killing each other in the slow, patient way limbs do when there is nobody there with a saw. 6 years. That is what the county extension man told me later when I described the healing on that last cut. 6 years of a man walking out to a row, putting one cut into the 12th tree, and walking back. So that is where I spread it, and I want to be honest about my reasoning, which was thin. I did not know if it would help. I knew the trees at that end of the block were on the sand, and I knew the leaves had come out small and pale the summer before, and I knew what my grandfather used to say about a hungry tree looking exactly like a lazy one, and mostly I knew that a man who has been handed something worthless needs a place to start, or the whole thing will swallow him. I started where my father stopped. That felt less like a plan than a way of asking him a question. My cousin came out in March. He had the good bottom ground and the 2 grain bins and the newer of the 2 tractors, and he had been decent about it in the way a man can be decent while he is winning, and he stood at the end of the 4th row with his hands in his coat pockets and looked at those dark stripes of manure going down under the trees and at the brush pile I had made, which by then was taller than the truck. "You're feeding a boneyard," he said. "Looks like it," I said. He nodded a while. Then he said my father had turned down $11,000 for the orchard block in 1978, and did I know that? And I said I did not. He said it like a kindness, the way you tell somebody the price of the mistake they have inherited so they will not go on believing it was a gift. He drove off before dark. I stood there in the row until the cold came up through my boots, thinking about $11,000 in 1978 and what a man wants so badly that he keeps it and then stops taking care of it. Pruning started the 2nd week of February, in that dead flat cold where the sky is the color of the inside of a bucket. I put the whetstone in my coat pocket to keep it from freezing, and I sharpened the pole saw every hour whether it needed it or not, because sharpening is rest that looks like work. I took the sprouts out first, thumb thick and gray, hundreds to a tree, and they came off with a snap you could hear 2 rows over. Sap froze on my sleeves. By the end of the 3rd day, my right shoulder had a hum in it that did not quit until April, and on the 8th day I came to the end of that row, to the last tree standing off by itself past where the block squared up, and I found the tag. It was a piece of aluminum about the size of 2 postage stamps, cut crooked with tin snips out of something else, and it hung on a short length of copper wire that the limb had long since swallowed. The bark had grown up over the wire on both sides like a lip closing over a splinter. I had to work the point of my knife under it and lift, gentle, the way you'd free a ring off a swollen finger, and even then the tag came away with a little curl of green wood attached to it. The letters had been pressed in from the back with a nail. I read them with my thumb before I read them with my eyes, because my eyes were watering from the cold and my thumb was the only part of me still telling the truth. My name. Both parts of it, the whole thing, spelled the way my father wrote it on the inside cover of my school books, with the middle letter that came from his mother's side. Under my name, a year. The year I turned 6. I stood there in that flat bucket-colored light, with the pole saw hanging off my arm, and I understood exactly nothing. My first thought, and I am not proud of it, was that he had marked the tree for taking out. Men do that. You blaze the ones that have quit on you so you know come winter which ones go to the woodpile, and I thought, well, he ran out of paint and used my name, and that is about the size of what he thought of me. I stood with that for a good long minute. Then I looked up into the tree. There were no sprouts in it, not one. 8 days I had been cutting gray sucker growth out of trees, so thick with it you could not see sky through the middle of them, hundreds to a tree, thumb thick, snapping off 2 rows over. And this tree, the last one, standing off by itself past where the block squared up, had an open vase center and clean heeled collars where the cuts had been made, and the newest of those cuts had a callus ring on it no more than 2, maybe 3 years old. Somebody had pruned that tree. Somebody had pruned that one tree every winter, in a bad shoulder and a worse chest, while 40 acres of winesap and Jonathan went to brush all around him. And then, standing under it, I remembered the apples. They came late. They hung on past the first hard frosts when everything else was down and bruising in the grass, and they were ugly, russeted, dull, the color of a saddle left out in the weather, with a rough patch at the stem like a scab. As a boy, I thought they were the culls. My father would put one in my coat pocket in November the way another man might hand you a nickel, and it tasted of honey and green walnut and something sharp behind that, and it stayed crisp so long that we were still eating them out of the cellar sand at lambing time in March. I had not thought about those apples in 15 years. I had not thought about them once, in all the months I'd been out there, and it shames me some to say it. That night I got out the account books. I had been living in those ledgers all winter for spray dates and weather, and I had read right past the thing that was in every one of them. On the last ruled page of every single book, in a hand that got worse as the years went, there was a short column of writing that had nothing to do with the rest of the orchard. Bloom, May 9. Bloom, May 11. Cold snap after. No harm. First fruit, 1963. 11 apples. Dropped 4. 47 fruits. No scab. No bitter pit. Held in cellar to April 2nd. Still sound. Held to April 19th. Wood hardy. No winter injury. -12. 20-some years of it. One tree. Watch the way a man watches a child sleeping, while the rest of it went to sprout and shade, and the county wrote it off, and I wrote it off too. In the back of the newest book, folded in thirds, were the letters. Carbons, most of them, thin as onion skin, to a nursery down in Missouri, Deacon's brothers, registered nurserymen, and to a man at the state college who signed himself only with initials. My father asking, in those flat, courteous sentences of his, whether they had any interest in a seedling that came up on its own in a fence row, that kept till spring in an unrefrigerated cellar, that had not showed scab in 19 years without one drop of spray. Their answers, wanting fruit samples in the fall, wanting bloom dates. Wanting to know had he ever sold or given away wood off it, and at the very bottom of the pile, sealed, stamped, addressed in his hand and never mailed, a letter dated the October before he died. I did not open it. I have been asked about that more times than anything else in my life, and the honest answer is that it was addressed to a man in Missouri, and it was not addressed to me. I wrote on the back of the envelope, small, under the flap, "My father passed in the spring. I have the tree. It is still standing, and it is still bearing," and I signed my name, which I now knew was on it in aluminum. I mailed it on a Tuesday from the store in town, and then I went home and did the only useful thing I could think of. I cut scionwood, last year's growth, pencil thick, straight as I could find it, and I made the cuts the way 8 days of practice had taught me, with a knife I had put on the whetstone until it would shave the hair off my arm. 10 sticks to a bundle, damp newspaper, then a bread bag, then labeled in pencil because ink runs, and I laid them against the north cellar wall where the thermometer never came off 34 degrees all winter. I did not have the first-eyed idea whether the man I had written to was still alive, or whether the address I had copied out of my father's ledger had gone to weeds the same way everything else he quit keeping up had gone. That winter I checked the bundles every Sunday like a man checking on livestock. I would take the lamp down the cellar steps, pull back the bread bag, and look at the cut ends to see if any of them had started to callus over or mold, and then I would fold the newspaper back the way it was and set them against the stone and go up. The thermometer held at 34. On the shelves across from the scion wood sat 2 crates of last fall's fruit off that one tree, russeted, a little greasy under the thumb, and every few weeks I would eat one standing there in the cold with my coat still on. They got better as the winter went. In November, they were just a hard apple. By February, there was something in them like anise and old honey, and the flesh had gone from white to a color closer to cream, and I began to understand why a man in 1961 would take the trouble to punch a name into a strip of aluminum with a nail set. I pruned the rest of that block through the thaw, and I burned brush on 9 separate days, and the smoke went up straight in the cold and laid out flat when the wind came, and I did not get an answer until the 9th of March. It came the way news came out there, which is to say it came through the store. Arlis took the call, wrote it on the back of a feed slip in pencil, and sent it out with the mail carrier, and it said a man would be coming Thursday, and would I be home? I was home. I had been home for a year and a half by then, and every soul in that county knew it. He came up the lane in a green car with out-of-state plates and mud to the door handles, and he got out slow the way men do who have been driving since 4 in the morning. 70 maybe. Cloth cap, a canvas satchel, and a cloth tape measure, and a camera on a strap, and a mimeographed list folded into quarters and gone soft at the creases from being carried. "You're the one wrote the letter," he said. I said I was. He did not shake my hand right away. He stood there with the door open and his cap in his fist, and looked up the hill past the barn at the rows, counting them the way a man counts cattle, left to right, and then hunting for the one that broke the pattern. He found it without any help from me. It stood off past where the block squared up, taller than the others and leaning south the way a tree leans when nothing has ever crowded it. And he put his cap back on and said, "That's it then," and started walking before I could tell him where the ground went soft. He worked slow and he worked quiet, tape around the trunk at 4 feet, and he read the number out loud to himself and wrote it down. Photographs from 4 sides with his own folding rule laid against a fruit spur for size, leaves into a manila envelope, licked and sealed and dated in pencil. He got down on one knee in the wet grass and looked at the graft union at the base, the old swell of it, and he pressed his thumb against the tag where the wire had already started to sink into the limb, and he read my name off the zinc without any expression at all, first and last, the way you'd read a road sign. Then he asked me what it kept like. I took him down to the cellar. It was the 22nd of April, and there were still 4 crates in the dark on the north wall, where the thermometer had not moved off 34 degrees since November, and the fruit in them had gone a little slack in the skin and a little greasy the way that fruit does, and he picked one up and wiped it on his sleeve and opened his pocket knife. He ate about a third of it standing on the cellar steps with the daylight coming down past his shoulder. He did not say a thing. He cut another slice and ate that too, and then he took out the mimeographed list, the one folded into quarters and gone soft at the creases, and he opened it on his knee and ran his thumb down the second column and stopped. He turned the paper so I could see. It was a list of names of things believed gone. 200 and some, typed crooked, each one with a year beside it. The last year anybody had put it in a catalog or a fair record. My name was on that list, not near it, on it. Same spelling, and a year in the 1890s, and after it in parentheses the words, "No living trees reported." I sat down on the step below him because my legs asked me to. My father had not named a seedling after his child. He had named his child after a tree. 40-some years I had carried that name around, been called it across a yard and up a school hallway and out of a church pew, and never once wondered where he got it, because the man was not in the habit of explaining himself, and I was not in the habit of asking. The man in the cloth cap stayed until the light went. He came back in February with 2 other men, and they cut scion wood off that tree on a still cold morning when the mercury sat at 9 degrees, pencil-thick sticks about 10 inches long, and they wrapped them in damp newspaper and sealed them in bread bags and labeled them in grease pencil. I stood there and held the bags open. That was the whole of my contribution to the science of it. The bulletin came that fall with a paragraph and 1 gray photograph of a tree that looked like nothing much, and after that came the letters. A man in Missouri, a woman who ran a nursery out of a converted dairy barn in the eastern part of the state, a university that wanted budwood and sent a form with 16 blanks on it, 2 brothers who drove 11 hours and would not come inside for coffee. I learned to cut scion wood the way you learn anything worth knowing, badly at first, and I never charged a soul for it. 10 sticks in a wet feed sack, the name written on the outside in pencil so they would have the spelling right, and a piece of paper telling them what the cellar wall told me about how long the fruit would hold. The county man came too. He was the one who had stood in that same lane a year and a half before with his boot up on a windfall apple, rolling it under his sole while he told me what the place would bring as stove wood if I got somebody with a saw and a strong back. He remembered saying it. I could tell by the way he took his hat off before he was all the way out of the truck, which is a thing a man does when he is carrying an old sentence around in his mouth and would rather set it down somewhere soft. "Mother's got a bare spot by her clothesline," he said. "She's 81. She wants a tree she can name." So I cut him 10 sticks of 1-year wood out of the water sprouts on the south side, wrapped them in a wet feed sack, and wrote the name on the outside in pencil the way I had learned to do it, and I did not say one word about stove wood. He stood there turning the bundle over like it might have a price tag hidden it somewhere. Then he did the thing I have thought about 100 times since. He looked past me at the last tree, at the whole crooked spread of it with the props under the east limb and the whitewash going gray on the trunk, and he said, "Somebody's filed on you." That is how I learned about the complaint. He told it flat, the way you tell a man his fence is down. There was an ordinance on the county books from 1948, put there when the commercial men still had pull, that made an unsprayed orchard a nuisance if it sat within a half-mile of trees under cultivation. Nobody had used it in 30 years. It had been sleeping in the code book like a wasp in a window sash. Dean Mabry had put in 9 acres of semi-dwarf on the 10-mile road 2 springs back, all on wire, all in straight lines, and he had borrowed money against every one of them, and my father's old block sat a 1/4 mile off his northwest corner with its dead scaffolds and its hollow trunks and its 40 years of no spray at all. "He's not mean," Lyle said. "He's scared." "I know it," I said. "State man'll come out in June, whenever they get to it." He tucked the feed sack under his arm like a loaf of bread. "You'd do well to get some of that dead wood out of there before he does." I stood in the lane a long while after his truck went over the culvert. The pear-shaped stones in that lane, I have walked them so many times I could tell you which one rocks. I thought about the ordinance and about the word nuisance, which is a small word for the thing it does, and I thought about how in the space of 18 months, the same land had gone from worthless to hazardous, without once getting to be simply good. I started the dead wood the next morning, which was the only answer I had. There was a lot of it. 40 years of neglect leaves a tree standing in a cage of its own history. Stubs where limbs broke in ice, black snags, whole scaffolds gone punk and light as balsa, and inside the punk wood the tunnels and the frass and the little yellow-headed grubs that borers leave. I took it out with a bow saw and a pruning saw and a pair of loppers that had been my father's, and I burned the piles in the low corner where the frost sits, and the smoke of old apple wood is a sweet, thick, cider-smelling smoke that gets in your coat and stays a week. It took me 11 days to clean 30 trees. My hands cracked open across the knuckles, and I taped them and kept on. On the 9th day I found it. I was up in the last tree on the orchard ladder, working out a broken stub high on the east side, and I put my hand on a young shoot to move it out of my way, and it did not move like a live shoot moves. It hung. The leaves on it had gone black-brown, not the dry brown of drought, but a wet, scorched brown, like something had been held to a flame and then rained on, and the tip of the shoot had curled over on itself in a tight hook. A shepherd's crook, the books call it. I had read about it all winter in a borrowed bulletin at the kitchen table without once believing it would come to my tree. There was a bead of amber on the bark below the curl, sticky as sap and not sap, fire blight, in the mother tree, in the only tree there was. I want to tell you I did the sensible thing. I sat down on the ladder step with my legs hanging in the leaves, and I did not move for I do not know how long, and the wind came through and turned the good leaves over and showed their pale sides, and every one of them looked to me like it was already dying. Then I climbed down, went to the barn, got a coffee can of bleach water and a clean saw, and I went back up and cut that shoot out 12 inches below the lowest blackening, and I dipped the saw in the can before I set it against wood again, and I carried the cut piece down the ladder held out away from my body like a snake and put it in the fire. Then I went over that tree limb by limb, 4 hours, on a ladder that wanted to slide on the wet grass, and I found 2 more strikes and 1 old canker on the north scaffold with a sunken edge to it that I did not want to think about at all, because a canker like that has been there a while, and a canker like that means the disease did not blow in from Dean Mabry's block or anybody else's. It had been living in that tree, quiet, maybe longer than I had been alive, which put a new question in me, and it has never quite gone out. My father stopped pruning this whole orchard the year I turned 9. He let 30 trees go to brush and rot and borers. And he kept one tree open to the light for 40 years. And he kept the whitewash on it. And he kept a saw hanging in the barn with a rag and a jar of bleach water underneath it that I had always taken for a rag and a jar. He knew. He had been cutting this out of that tree for decades, alone, without telling one living soul what he was fighting or why. And I had already put that tree's wood into wet feed sacks and mailed it to 11 states. It took me 2 nights to write the 11 letters, and I wrote every one of them by hand because a typed letter would have looked like an office, and I wanted them to look like a man at a kitchen table, which is what I was. I had the shipping list in front of me in the back of the ledger, 11 names in 11 towns, Ohio and Indiana and Missouri, 2 in New York, 1 in Vermont, 1 clear out in Oregon where I could not picture the weather. I told them plainly. I told them there was something in the wood I had sent them, something dark that ran in the heart of the limb and did not show on the bark until it was too far along to save, and that my father had spent 40 years cutting it out of that tree 1 limb at a time and had never once said its name out loud to me. Then I told them how he did it. Cut a foot below the stain, not an inch, a foot. Born what you take, that same day, do not stack it. Dip the blade in bleach water between every cut, every single cut, and change the water when it stops smelling sharp. Whitewash the trunk to the crotch in March, and check it every year in the bare season when you can see the shape of what you have. The shortest line in all 11 letters was the one I meant most. I wrote, I did not know when I sent it. I know now. Mildred at the post office weighed the envelopes the same way she had weighed the wet feed sacks the spring before, one eyebrow up, and she said, "You are having a busy year with the mail." And I said I was, and she put the stamps on straight and did not ask. 9 of the 11 wrote back. That is a better number than I had any business expecting. 2 of them lost the grafts in the second summer and told me so without heat, the way you tell a man the weather has been dry. 1 in Indiana, a Mennonite outfit with 14 acres of standard trees, wrote back 4 lines, and one of them was thank you for the bleach water. 1 in New York wrote me an angry letter, and I read it twice and put it in the drawer and answered it with the same instructions I had already sent, and 18 months later he wrote again to say the tree was clean and growing and that he had been unfair, and he sent a photograph of it with his boy standing beside it in a coat too big for him. The old man in Missouri is the one I think about. His hand was like barbed wire on the page, and it took me an evening to get it all read. He said, we called it the ink. He said his father had cut the ink out of a tree behind their milk house for 30 years and never told his own brother, who farmed a mile away and would have wanted cuttings. He said men kept quiet about it because a whisper of it in a county could kill the sale of every nursery tree in that county for 10 years, sound or not, and because a man with the ink in his orchard got looked at like a man with something catching in his house. I have turned that over a long while, and here is as far as I have gotten. I think my father let those 30 trees go on purpose. Brush and borers and a bad name keep people out of a place better than a fence and a padlock, and nobody ever once in 40 years drove up that lane and asked him for wood off a tree in an orchard that everybody in the township had already agreed was finished. He kept one tree open to the light and let the rest go to ruin around it like a hedge of thorns, and he stood in there alone with a saw and a jar every February, and he could have written all of that down on a single page for me, and he did not. That part is his. I have made my peace with owning the work and not owning the reason. The county man came back that next fall with a mimeographed bulletin, 4 pages, a Latin name in it that no one in this township has ever said aloud. He asked if he could photograph the saw. I took him out to the barn and he stood there a while, looking at it on its 2 nails with the rag under it and the jar sitting where the jar had always sat, and he took his hat off, which men of that office do not generally do in barns. How long? He said. 40 years. By himself? Far as I know. He put the hat back on. Then he asked what my father had called the method, and I said he had never called it anything, he had just gone out and done it, and the county man wrote that down too, though I do not know how he made it fit in a bulletin. They came back, the ones who had laughed, not all at once and not with apologies, because that is not how it goes here. They came with a jar of preserves set on the truck seat, or with a question asked sideways about whether that wood would take on an old seedling tree they had in the fence line. I never charged a soul for scion wood, not one stick, not in 31 years. I would cut it in front of them so they could see how to read a stain, and I would send them home with a page of instructions in my own hand and a paper cup of bleach water they mostly poured out before they got to the road. Some of them did the work. Enough did. There are trees of it now in more states than I have ever driven through, and every nursery list that carries it carries the name my father wrote on that tag in pencil, which is my name, which he gave me twice and only explained once, and then only in wood. Last February, I went in with the saw at dusk, the ground ringing hard under my boots, and I made the year's one cut in the low east limb and dipped the blade and stood there in the smell of bleach and cold apple sap while the light went blue over the ridge. The whitewash showed up like a lit lamp in all that gray, the way it does when the sun quits and the trunks go to shadow, and that one painted body of wood keeps hold of the last of the light. I put the saw in the sled and did not hurry back. The tag is in a jelly jar on the kitchen sill now, out of the weather, the pencil gone soft and brown but still legible if you turn it toward the window. He wrote it the year he stopped pruning, which means he wrote it knowing he would not see the fruit, and he never said a word about it to me, not in the hospital, not before. I have made my peace with being told in wood instead of in words. It is a slower way to hear a thing, and it lasts longer. The old man from the co-op came out one more spring, took the fruit in both hands the way you hold something that might be warm, and said, well, he knew. That was all either of us needed. Come March, I will scrape the moss off the north side and paint it again. The tree is old. It leans east now, toward the road my father used to watch, and every year it sets one more crop than anybody expects of it.